Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as we look now at the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. Because when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson became president. He had been a congressman and senator from Texas for over 20 years and was chosen as vice president partly to get Southern Democrats to vote for a Northern Catholic. Although Johnson was not entirely a traditional Southern Democrat, he had played a big role in getting Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957, although partly getting it through by guaranteeing it would be a fairly mild Civil Rights Act. In fact, Johnson was very effective at working with Congress. He had been a congressman for years and had many connections. He knew exactly how to reach each person there, who could be persuaded, who could be bribed, and who could be bullied, and how to do each. He also overwhelmed people with his sheer size and force of personality. Winning the passage of many laws was what was called the Johnson treatment. And as president, Johnson used his connections in Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to outlaw many types of discrimination. Not only did it help black people and other ethnic minorities, but Title VII of the Civil Rights Act also prohibited many types of discrimination based on sex. Johnson did not just want to fight discrimination, though. He also declared a war on poverty, a phrase Kennedy had used, particularly after seeing the poverty of the people of West Virginia when he campaigned in the Democratic primaries there. Johnson, though, would begin to turn that phrase into policy. Not only did he get Kennedy's middle-class tax cuts pushed through Congress, but he created programs to promote education and provide job training for many Americans. VISTA, or Volunteers in Service to America, was created to train volunteers similar to the Peace Corps to work in poor urban and rural areas in America, particularly in Appalachia, to provide education and medical assistance. Indeed, Johnson's war on poverty focused attention and federal funding on Appalachia, partly through the Appalachian Regional Commission, or ARC, which had already been created by the governors of a number of Appalachian states, but which now began to receive significant federal funding. And over time, the geographical extent of the official Appalachia has extended further and further as congressmen have sought federal funds for areas that are not especially mountainous. Johnson also created Head Start to help prepare young children for school, of classes in particular whose parents might not be able to provide them with preschool or with other educational advantages that middle or upper class parents might. The Food Stamp Act of 1964 expanded on a pilot program begun by Kennedy and appropriated $75 million to provide food for the poor, and appropriations expanded in future years and were closely tied to agricultural subsidies to make sure that rural populations who wanted farm subsidies would support food stamps, which largely subsidized the urban poor, and likewise urban populations would support farm subsidies for the rural populations. While Johnson was president, minimum wage reached its highest point ever. In 1968, the minimum wage in the United States was $1.60 an hour, equivalent to earning $11.63 in 2018. And in 1964, Johnson ran for president in his own right, and would face Barry Goldwater, who was from the conservative wing of the Republican Party. When facing Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, Republicans had run men from the moderate and really the liberal wing of the Republican Party at a time when there were still moderates, liberals, and conservatives in both parties. But now there was a real backlash to Johnson's big spending. Barry Goldwater opposed this, believing the federal government should do as little as possible, while people should take responsibility for themselves. He would have lowered taxes significantly and cut welfare and many other government programs. Although, while in general he wanted a very limited, inactive government, there was one exception, and that was he favored a strong stand against the Soviet Union and communism in general, being supportive of heavy military spending. After all, for someone who hates intrusive government, there is no government more intrusive than that of Soviet communism. Republicans said, in your heart, you know he's right. Democrats said, in your guts, you know he's nuts. As Johnson's campaign played out some of Goldwater's more extreme views, suggesting he would end civil rights legislation, which might be true. Although not opposed to states passing civil rights laws, he did not think the federal government should do so. They even said he might provoke a nuclear war. And it was not so hard to paint him as an extremist when he himself said extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. In 1964, Barry Goldwater lost the election in a landslide, carrying only his home state of Arizona and 5 southern states, states in the Deep South who had never before voluntarily voted for a Republican, but who were now furious at Lyndon Johnson for his support of civil rights. But while Goldwater lost this election, it's still seen by many as the beginning of the modern conservative movement, particularly that strand of the conservative movement that favors small government. Although Goldwater himself later turned against some conservatives, religious conservatives, as he felt that legislating morality was intrusive as well. Now, among the 486 electoral votes that Johnson got were the 3 votes of Washington, D.C., which in 1961 had been given the right to vote in presidential elections through the 23rd Amendment, guaranteeing Washington, D.C. 3 electoral votes. Theoretically, they could have even more, but realistically, that is the limit. And so, with Johnson elected as president and with Democrats in control of the House and the Senate, they planned to expand his war on poverty in order to create a great society in which poverty and discrimination would end and the government would take care of everybody. Johnson believed that better education and better health care were necessary to end poverty, and so he created Medicare, government-sponsored health care for the elderly, and Medicaid, government-sponsored health care for the poor and the disabled. He increased funding for education, primarily public education, although he found ways to get money to private schools too, officially by giving the money to the students and not the schools. One of the main ways he funded public education was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, which gave federal money to public schools, but with some strings attached about how they taught their students. This does have to be renewed periodically. Every time it is renewed, more strings are attached. In the 21st century in particular, it is often tied federal funding to standardized testing. To promote the construction of highways and to support public transportation, such as buses in big cities, Johnson created the Department of Transportation as a cabinet-level position. And to help house the urban poor, he created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD for short, and appointed Robert Weaver to lead the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the first black man to serve in the U.S. cabinet. Although Johnson, for all his support of civil rights in some ways, typically referred to Secretary Weaver, by terms today would be considered rude to refer to a black man. The Great Society would protect the environment, and modern environmentalism began after Rachel Carson's publication of Silent Spring in 1962, describing the effects of chemical fertilizers and pesticides on wildlife, particularly birds and insects. And this encouraged the creation of the Water Quality Act of 1965, the Clean Water Restoration Act of 1966, which, along with the Clean Air Act of Kennedy's administration, were the first major anti-pollution laws in the U.S. at the federal level. and pretty clearly necessary. This was a time when some rivers in northern cities were so polluted you could flick your cigarette butt into the river and it would burst into flame. Some northern rivers caught on fire multiple times in the 1960s. A great society would welcome everyone, and the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 allowed far more immigrants to come to America, opening the doors of immigration wide for the first time since 1920, and encouraging immigration from Eastern Europe and Latin America, places dominated by or threatened by communism. Whereas for the previous 44 years, only immigrants from Western Europe had really been welcome in the United States. In many ways, Johnson's war on poverty was successful. Between 1960 and 1970, the percentage of Americans living in poverty dropped from 22.2% to 12.6%. To be sure, the federal government defines the policy or poverty line and occasionally moves the definition upward or downward, depending on whether they want to show more or less poverty in the U.S. But clearly, the number of people living in deep poverty significantly declined. And Johnson and Congress were not the only reformers in the 1960s. The Supreme Court, too, sought to reshape society under the leadership of Earl Warren. Originally appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, in part in exchange for Warren's support of Eisenhower in the 1952 election. Under his leadership, the Warren Court would change society. Baker versus Carr in 1962 and Reynolds versus Sims in 1964 required states to make sure that electoral districts were equal, which may not sound real exciting, but was actually very important, as this recognized the growing importance of cities. In many cases, electoral districts had not been redrawn in years. In Tennessee, for example, affected by the case of Baker versus Carr, where Charles Baker, a Shelby County, Tennessee Republican, said he was underrepresented. His voting districts had not been redrawn since 1901. But in the previous 60 years, urban populations had grown much faster than rural populations. So that urban areas were significantly underrepresented in state legislatures and in Congress. And so forcing states to redraw their electoral districts shifted political power towards urban areas. Indeed, Earl Warren believed that these were the most significant cases he decided. And there were more rights for others too, including accused criminals. Clarence Gideon had been accused of breaking into a pool hall and looting a cigarette machine, a jukebox, and a cash register in 1961 based on the testimony of one witness. Unable to afford an attorney, he tried to represent himself but was found guilty and sent to prison. But there he began doing his own research in the prison library and appealed the decision, eventually writing to the U.S. Supreme Court on prison stationery. And in 1963, the case of Gideon versus Wainwright, supplemented by later cases, determined that someone accused of a crime has a right to a lawyer. And because it is a right, that means the state must provide one to someone who cannot afford it. Now, in 1960, Danny Escobedo was accused of shooting his brother-in-law, who, from what I've read, probably had it coming. He was held by the police, and during 14 and a half hours of interrogation, during which he repeatedly asked for a lawyer but was ignored, he finally admitted to knowing about the shooting, and that was interpreted as an admission of guilt, for which he was convicted and imprisoned. But he appealed, and in 1964, in the case of Escobedo versus Illinois, the Supreme Court determined that people held by the police also had a right to an attorney during police questioning, as well as during their trial. But not all criminals are aware of all the latest Supreme Court rulings, and this was the case for Ernesto Miranda, who in 1963 kidnapped and raped an 18-year-old girl. He was arrested, and after 2 hours alone in police custody, he signed a written confession of his guilt, not being aware of his right to an attorney or his right to remain silent. Based on that confession, he was sentenced to 20 to 30 years in jail, but he appealed. And in 1966, the case of Miranda versus Arizona overturned his conviction on the grounds that he did not know he had a right to remain silent or the right to have an attorney present, which is why, at least on cop shows, whenever someone's arrested, they're always read their Miranda rights. Because the case determined, too, that accused criminals had to be informed of their rights derived from the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Miranda later made money selling signed cards listed with people's Miranda rights. He was later stabbed to death in the parking lot of a bar. Earl Warren's court also supported the separation of church and state. For most of American history, it had been common for prayer and Bible readings to be part of the school day in public schools and private. But this was challenged. And in 1962, in the case of Engel versus Battelle, the Warren Court ruled that requiring students to pray in public schools violated the First Amendment. Some schools later switched to having a moment of silent prayer, but eventually even that was challenged, saying students couldn't be told to pray even silently. Schools then switched in many cases to requiring a moment of silence, the purpose of the silence not being defined. The next year, 1963, the case of Abington versus Shemp decided that requiring students to read the Bible, or having a teacher read the Bible under many circumstances, also violated the First Amendment. And both of these decisions made many Americans fear that the government, or at least some politicians in the government, were opposed to religion and were trying to destroy its role in public life, where it had shaped so much of American life and society since the first settlement of our country. And these fears formed another part of the creation of the modern conservative movement, as religious conservatives hoped to stop or even reverse the trend of religion being separated from public life. Although, as mentioned before, the small government conservative movement and the religious conservative movement do not always work well together, although often they cooperate in a broader conservative movement. While Johnson was pretty liberal in many ways, when it came to the containment of communism, he remained quite conservative. Johnson escalated American involvement in Vietnam throughout his presidency to contain communism in Southeast Asia. He sent troops into the Dominican Republic when a pro-American dictatorship there was threatened by possibly communist forces. And as the war in Vietnam dragged on, and as America supported other anti-communist regimes around the world, some countries became increasingly critical of America's actions. Some countries expelled Peace Corps volunteers. In France, Charles de Gaulle, the president, removed France from NATO's military alliance and ordered NATO troops out of France in 1966, while simultaneously developing France's nuclear weapons program, having tested their first 3 atomic bombs in the Algerian Sahara in 1960. And with the U.S. busy in Vietnam, the Soviets took advantage of the situation to gain increased influence in the Arab world, particularly in Egypt. Although Soviet help was not enough to let Egypt and some of Egypt's allies beat Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967. In June of 1967, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, with help too from Iraq, all attacked Israel, following a series of border incidents. And although the Arabs were armed with new Soviet planes and other weapons, they were unable to take over Israel, who had American weapons of their own. Indeed, in 6 days, Israel more than doubled its territory at the expense of its 3 neighboring attackers, taking from Syria the Golan Heights, from Jordan the West Bank, which Jordan in turn had seized from Palestinian control shortly after Israel's creation. The city of Jerusalem, which was guaranteed as a neutral city by the United Nations, was occupied by Israel. The Gaza Strip around the city of Gaza was taken from Egypt, who in turn had occupied this Palestinian territory immediately after Israel and Palestine were created. Israel also took the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt in a massive victory for Israel in this 6-day war. One of the most controversial parts of this would be the occupation of the West Bank. Israel continued to assert that at some point the West Bank and Gaza should form the basis of some kind of Palestinian state, but since the 6-day war has also at times encouraged settlement of these areas by Jewish settlers, which would make it hard to ever give the land back to Palestinian control. At the time, most of Western Europe and the U.S. was very supportive of Israel. In later years, many Europeans and some Americans too would criticize Israel's occupation of these Palestinian territories. And an enormous embarrassment for the United States. In January of 1966, USS Pueblo, an American warship operating off the coast of North Korea but in international waters, although spying on North Korea to be sure, was attacked and captured by the North Korean Navy on January 23, 1968. The sailors were interned, later released, but only after being starved and tortured by the North Koreans. North Korea still held the Pueblo as a monument to their power over the United States. Furthermore, Pueblo is only the second American warship captured since the Barbary Wars. The Japanese did capture one, USS Wake, in World War II. This was a huge embarrassment for the United States, and in the vast propaganda war of the Cold War, a contest to win the hearts and minds of the world, every embarrassment was serious. And over time, American involvement in Vietnam became increasingly embarrassing too, as the war seemed to be taking a turn for the worse in early 1968. And this would lead to Lyndon Johnson's decision not to seek another term in 1968.